And
excuse me, I'm just going to start again.
and we all understand that. But unless it is talked about constantly, it's not going to get better. People get bored. Oh, is it that again? They pull in a race card again. Why do we have to talk about that? Well, because it's uncomfortable. And there has to be an uncomfortable element in the discourse for anything to change. You know, whether it's an LGBT movement or, you know, women's suffrage, race, it doesn't matter. People have to be made to feel uncomfortable. And especially white people, because we're comfortable. We still have no clue of what being born white means. And if you read some of the, you know, recent literature, you'll realize it really is no such thing as whiteness. But we kind of made it up. That's not my original thought, but it's true. And it's hard to sit down and decide that, yes, it's like you're at the 50 meter mark in a 100-meter dash. And you got that kind of a lead. Yes, because you were born white, you have advantages that are systemically, culturally, psychologically there. And they've been built up and cemented for hundreds of years. But many people can't look at it. It's too difficult. People want to hold their position. People want the status quo. People don't want to give that up. And until it's given up, it's not going to be fixed.
Way to go, Greg. I say, way to go, Greg. Awesome. I love it. And this is another one here. Again, these links are not, they're not required unless I actually tell you you need to have this on the list by the end of this week. I'll supply you with a list. But they're not required. They're not going to be, you're not going to be tested on them, okay? So this here is just kind of looking at what Indigenous peoples around the world are doing, and it's a good little read. The Mabuchi women, what they're doing, how they really are trying to work on maintaining and sustaining the ecosystems in their area, and the incredible work that they're doing around the world, Indigenous peoples, and in the hope that their area can continue to provide livelihood for their children and their grandchildren's children's children, all right? So those are for you to review. Okay, so let's get into the textbook here. I am just going to pull this up like this now. So first meetings, we look at page 42, getting into it. Please note the timelines again. It kind of always helps you just to take a look, a review of it. The timelines that are always put at the beginning of every chapter. It kind of spells out a bit of the timeline that the chapter covers. So first meetings occurred over a 900-year period. The Dene of the far northwest were the last to meet whites in the early 1900s. And they kind of, the author breaks it down into three main first meetings: collisions, relationships, and contacts. The first, collisions, they're the transmission of diseases, they're enslavement, they're more of the volatile meetings, all right? Then you have relationships, trade, evangelism, colonial administration. This is what you're going to see as we start to get into this textbook now. And contacts, very brief, usually peaceful meetings, all right? So those are the first ones, and the chapter starts with looking at those. So long before the present era, the people of ancient China became known as navigators. Paiyu, I'm probably massacring that. But it starts talking about this. If there were non-Indigenous influences at work in the Americas, they most likely came by the easiest and quickest route available, the sea. Long before the present era, the people of ancient Southeast China, the navigators, we can only speculate as to where these early sailors went. However, the peanut, an American plant, has turned up at two coastal Chinese sites dating to around 5300 to 4800 before the current era. Then two varieties of chickens considered to be native to Asia were already established in America when the Spanish arrived. Chinese records tell of a search for islands in the eastern Pacific Ocean where drugs for longevity could be found, as well as magical beings and strange things. One such expedition around 2200 before the current era resulted in 3,000 young men and women being sent a few years later. Their mission was to establish a trade in the longevity drug, but they were never heard from again. Likely, we'll never know for certain whether this account refers to the Americas. Also, in 458 after the current era, so this is the beginning of the Dark Ages that we looked at in that module, or that topic, okay? Chinese records tell us the monk Huoshan with 4 companions sailed to the east and reached the island of Fusang, believed to be present-day Mexico, where he stayed for 40 years, returning to China in 499 ACE. Okay? In 1956, archaeologists discovered ceramics at Valdivia in southwestern Ecuador, dated to around 5200 to 4800 BCE. All right? So it's around the same time of the Chinese sites that we referenced earlier, okay? At that time, by far the oldest known such artifacts in the Americas. Their striking resemblance to Japanese pottery set off a wave of speculation that the Japanese introduced pottery making to the Americas. Eventually, however, even older ceramics that had no resemblance to Valdivia ware came to light, ending that particular debate, but leaving open the question of the origin of pottery in the Americas. Japanese connections continue to be debated by historians. This hasn't ended, this debate. And there continues to be speculations about former contacts. Pottery might have come into what is now Canada from Asia via Alaska and Yukon, or from the south into the east, both before 5000, before the current era. All right. The pottery problem, if anything, fueled the controversy over transoceanic contacts in general, and their role in cultural diffusion in particular. How did the cultures of the world, human cultures of the world, was there any intermixing? Was there any influences that have led to what we have today? This is again looking at social history, right? And the influences that we may have had it with one hemisphere to the other hemisphere and back and forth, okay? The issue of the Japanese connection, far from dead, as a particular type of mace considered to be peculiar to Japan, has surfaced in Ecuador, dated sometime before 1500, before the current era. Interestingly, in the far north, the bow and arrow appeared about this time, or shortly before, and spread rapidly southward. Japanese and indigenous peoples are the only peoples to sing death songs. If there was a connection with other peoples, however, indigenous peoples were soon experimenting on their own. Plants offer the strongest research evidence of early overseas connections between the Americas and the other world areas. Accordingly, the scene now shifts to Southeast Asia, mainly Cambodia, southern India, and the Maldive Islands. Maldive Islands, I think it's probably pronunciation. The argument here is for a trade contact, mainly with the Cambodian Khmers around 400 to 1000 ACE. Prevailing winds and currents made such commerce possible, but it could not have lasted past the 13th century. You're going to see that there was a climate change event, that the cooling started to happen. Plant evidence indicates an early India-America connection. Both South America and Southeast Asia shared bottle gourds, coconuts, and some varieties of yams. Similarly, cotton cultivated in Mexico and in Peru before 4500 BCE seems to have connections to Asia. Some argue that this could have occurred by natural processes, but botanists say that's highly unlikely that that could have happened. People appear to have been involved in this hybridization and cultivation of the domesticated plant that began in northwestern South America, probably Peru. And then kind of refers to maize, corn. I don't know if you're aware of this, but You know, it needs human beings in order to actually grow. Corn is an interesting one. And then further down, it talks about, not surprisingly, proponents of ancient contact between the Americas and overseas regions have eagerly supported these two cases. Since there is considerable resistance to the hypothesis of early contact before the time of the European exploration period, mainly on the grounds of insufficient seagoing technology at the time, the origin and development of gourds and cotton as crops remain unsolved problems. Further west, we find Egypt and Phoenicia, both being advocated for the honor of having reached the Americas. Archaeologist Thor Heyerdahl looked for men who could recreate the ancient type of watercraft required to sail the South Atlantic. He found them at Lake Chad in North Africa and Lake Titicaca in the Andean highlands. Heyerdahl has pointed out that Columbus reached the Caribbean by taking the ocean highway called the Canary Current. Carrying on a little further west, Spaniards later reached the Gulf of Mexico. It is in this region that the Olmec, the mother of American civilizations, appeared suddenly in a well-settled area about 3500 before the current era, during a time of natural disasters in and emigration from Afro-Eurasia. Very interesting. The Olmec influenced later city-states, such as the Mayans. It is not always clear, however, in which direction influences went. For instance, glyphic writing, once assumed to be an innovation of the Olmec in the Americas, was actually present centuries earlier, before 2600, before the current era, at Mount Alban in the land of the Zapotecs in present-day southwestern Mexico. It's all this western area that has this evidence, potential evidence, if you will, or question that bring up questions about what this could have been happening. There was only two other sites of the world where writing was indisputably invented. The other was Mesopotamia before 5000 BCE. And I kind of just saved a link here that I'll bring up just to kind of show you, as I needed to have some connection on some of this here. Actually, I think I actually saved it here tonight. Yeah, I did. Okay, so let's bring this back up again. So here is Mesopotamia. This is a very fertile area that written language is thought to have come. So, and the author of this textbook is talking about how all the influences would have come possibly. There's a current. This is the Canary Current that comes around here, right? I believe. Or this is the Japanese current. I think your textbook looks at that. See, this one here, on page 45, you see there's these natural ocean highways. If you can get on them, you just travel on them, and the current will just take you someplace. Those currents, of course, are changing right now because of climate change that's happening in the oceans. But at one time, there most definitely could possibly have been some transcontinental interchanges. And that's really what this chapter really tries to look at. So peopling of Polynesia was also referenced on page 46, including Aotearoa, or New Zealand. That's what the Maori call themselves, not New Zealand, right? Largely accepted that they came from Southeast Asia, however, would have had to come via the Americas along the only route available with the available sailing technology, and that's the Japanese current. That's right. Okay, so there it is again. Genetic studies have revealed a close relationship between South American indigenous peoples and Polynesians. Sweet potato, widespread throughout the Pacific, is an American crop. All right? Indigenous peoples of the Americas were also the first to master platinum metallurgy. Okay, so this is where you get this mixing together of metals and coming up with different variations. On page 46, it talks about how Peruvians manipulated sheets of gold, the sweat of the sun, and silver, tears of the moon, into desired forms with particular attention to surfaces and color, a style called transformation. Beaten metalwork is even older in the Americas. The old copper culture in the Lake Superior region and to the south dates to 6,000 before the current era, so that's 8,000 years ago. Europeans began very early in their relationship with indigenous peoples to benefit from the metallurgy of the Americas. So what we can say, very much for sure, varied as the cultures of the Americas were, they fit into a hemisphere-wide pattern, and like Europeans on the other side of the Atlantic, they shared a basic civilization. Scholars have characterized the indigenous civilizations of the Americas as having formidable originality. Okay? And talks about this little ice age I referenced. Norse settlements on northern Newfoundland and mainland Atlantic coasts did not last. There seem to have been 4 expeditions at the northern tip of Newfoundland, but hostilities developed between local people and the visitors. At sea, the Little Ice Age of about 1300 to 1850 caused the ice pack to thicken, interfering with shipping, which in any event had been irregular and was decreasing due to conditions in Europe. It eventually stopped, cutting off supplies from Norway on which the people's lifestyle depended. Eventually, the Norse abandoned their colonies in what's today called the New World. So the first contact with Europeans in the Americas occurred along this area to the northeastern Arctic along the Atlantic seaboard, okay? And it kind of introduces the Beartuck and Dorset, which we'll look a little bit at further near the end of this lecture. So, map 3.2, just for your interest here, these are where all the indigenous peoples were in what is today called Canada, okay? You'll see along the east, there's the Inuit, the Innu, you have the Omamawinini, the Micmac, the Wet'suwet'en, the Penobscot, the Wabanaki, and then you have the Six Nations as they come to be known, the Wendat. You're going to see where they are on the map because we're going to start getting into that story here in the next chapter. And then as you start to get onto the actual Great Plains, you see the different changes as it goes into the further north of the west. You see again the different changes of the peoples in that area as well. Okay? So that's just an FYI. So Frobisher, he brings back to motherland when he comes an Inuk hunter as a token of possession. This was actually a very common practice. This was to show as proof that they had discovered new land. So they would kidnap people, 1 or 2, possibly 2, 3, 4, whatever, and they would bring them back and display them. Now, the book talks also about the early actual stereotypes as they start to get developed very rapidly right from the beginning. Savages, raw meat eaters, eat like beasts, cannibals, idolaters, witches, but they're very tractable, very easy to civilize. And just again, keeping in mind what John Mohawk talked about when we refer to a people as being witches during this period of time, this is very serious. Why? Because back in Europe, they were burning witches at the stake. All right? And it was also a period when all non-Christians were viewed as enemies of Christians. The closest to most sustained contact during this period was along the Labrador coast of Belle Isle. The Inuit, of course, met Basque whalers and later French whalers. The Inuit, they introduced Europeans to deep-sea whaling expertise that they had perfected. The technology at that time was the most advanced in the world. And this contact lasted until the first decade of the 20th century. Severe reduction of fish stocks impacted local peoples and eventually started to lead to conflicts. And you're going to see this over-exploitation of resources, of creatures for capitalist goals, aims, is a common theme. Right through the whole story of colonization of what's today called Canada. Canada itself is based on the exploitation of peoples and land and creatures on the land, of the land. Okay? So combined with Europe's deep sea ships, the combined resulted in the growth of global whaling and the overexploitation of whales around the world. And I hope you're seeing this. I feel like I'm not showing you the entire screen. I think I'm just going to exit from this full screen because for some reason this thing is not sitting right and I can't move it. And I'm not going to start all over. Okay, so let's go. Continue on. We're just about done here. So fish were actually a first attraction of the Europeans. This is why they came. Every Friday they had to have Meatless Friday because of the faith they had in Europe, some of the peoples there. So you begin to see coming over here in their ships because you would literally, there are accounts where you would just look into the oceans and all you would see is enormous amount of fish. Very rich fishing grounds were found here because it wasn't overexploited. As I said last lecture, there was very careful management systems in place for not only land creatures but ocean creatures as well that people survived on for their livelihood. Oil was an important part, like the whale blubber. When it burns, apparently it burns very cleanly, and because they had the oil lamps, it became an important resource, exploitable resource for European consumers at the time. Right, so this was another reason that really pushed whaling to the limits that it was at. Until fur trade was established, contacts were infrequent enough not to have much impact on the separate lives of both Indigenous peoples and Europeans. In the latter part of the chapter looks at the Beothuk on page 52 to 55. The Beothuk, of course, they eventually are exterminated. There is that genocide, this idea that they become objectified, and the Europeans, in the end, they actually begin the process of open hunting, and they were just killing them, and they were being rewarded. I think this is where scalping kind of started too. If you brought in a scalp of them, you would get a reward for it. So you would get this run on killing certain people because they stood in the way, because they were eggs that had to be cracked, in Mohawk's words. The Columbus Exchange, end of the chapter, starts to look at it. I encourage you to take a look at this. I'm not going to go through it too much. It starts on page 53. It goes through the diseases that were brought here, that were brought back to Europe from here. It talks about the plants as well, and you're going to see, we've talked about this already. And animals, I don't know if you know this, but rats, they weren't here. They came from Europe, and they're actually accidentally imported through the ships. And that's why they're hard to get rid of here, because there's no real natural predator, if you will, to maintain rat populations over here. So, and then you start to see this other stuff too, other plants imported by Europeans, Kentucky bluegrass, dandelions, daisies. You see daisies everywhere. Well, daisies weren't here originally. Plants imported by Europeans for livestock, some forage plants and clover, although most would have traveled informally in clods of mud, folds of textiles, etc. Plants imported for commercial reasons, sugar, cotton, rice, indigo, Brazilian, cochineal, I can't say this next thing, antiote, it's for dyes, for clothing, for dyeing clothes. So this is stuff that it looks at in these pages here. Capitalism, the driving force of colonialism, right from the beginning, it was taking off in Europe at that time, and it became the driver, and we covered that already in a previous module. The hat was very much an essential part of men's fashion, so in 1534, when Jacques Cartier comes sailing down into the mouth of the St. Lawrence, and he's met with Indigenous women with the pelts of furs on them, that was very exciting, and this is where the French, after this, Jacques Cartier goes back And they begin to have this very serious interest on developing a monopoly on the fur trade globally and getting their furs from here. Why? Because what was happening in wars that were going on in Europe between the different nation states at that time, there were some of the ports were getting blocked. The Baltic port got blocked, and so you couldn't access a lot of the golds and spices from the Far East, and neither, because of other conflicts, could you access the furs of what's today called Russia and the colder regions. So this was a really good idea, a good opportunity for the French, and so they jumped on it. And this is where you begin to see the French taking on, right from the beginning, the position that they were going to develop a new France. They were going to intermarry. They weren't going to bring women here. They were going to bring men here to marry the women here. It was going to be church sanctioned, and we're going to go through this in a little bit more detail. And we were going to develop a new France here, with the people here, with some conditions, of course, and we'll look at that as well. And the chapter ends by looking at these two ethos that we talked about in our first module. And again, just to highlight some of the stuff that the chapter book looks at, and I've taught this to you already, and we're going to look at it in more depth, some of them, as we're going to kind of play it with some of the other material. Very egalitarian societies, very much about hospitality, sharing, and you've seen that in your Treaty Elders of Saskatchewan book. As well, humor. Humans are part of this transcendent universal system. Land can't be owned. The flip side of it was they were fragmented. They had no real shared military defense on a large scale. Very much a civilization that was hemisphere-wide, though, with regional manifestations. And then it kind of flips it around in the next paragraph, looking at the European ways. Society of nation-states were over there. They came here, very patriarchal. Rulers were men, developing capitalism at the time, very much into colonization, exploitation, game, and anybody's property was theirs of the ruling class. They understood the importance of human labor, and took it to the extreme of slavery. You're going to see that there was slavery here as well, but it was different. It was a different kind of slavery. Okay, it comes in on some of the material that we're going to look at. Ethnocentrism, the understanding that, like, France is superior to Great Britain. That's why they're always fighting that 100-year war before Columbus came to over here. You have these monarchies believing that one of their nation, their country is better than another one, and they're superior. So this is very much, and that, not saying that kind of wasn't here, but not to the extreme that understanding drove the peoples as they were being driven by over there. A whole combination of a lot of these traits of the European societies really provided the fodder, if you will, for that mentality of utopian ideologies of believing that there's a supreme race that eventually kind of manifests by the time you get to John A. Macdonald in the 1800s. It was a step by step, but just a very much solidification. You could say that race was really born in the period of after the Moors are pushed off the Iberian Peninsula because they're dark-skinned, and that everything that was against Christ and Christianity, it was this dark-skinned. You get all these steps, and a lot of it is. You gotta try to figure it out, and try to make sense of it in your own way through your readings, studying history. That's why research is so important. As you start to piece together a lot of this stuff. Wade Davis, I'm going to kind of try to bring in some of his material as well. He's an anthropologist. He's an amazing anthropologist, and he's Canadian. He's done some amazing work with National Geographic over the years in studying Indigenous peoples of the world. And if you want to Google him, that would be a good one to do. Wade Davis. Wade Davis, W-A-D-E-D-A-V-I-S. He's in BC. Private property, classes of people, ownership of land. All right. And I think that's a wrap on this one. I did want to kind of just maybe end a bit. It's already at 45 minutes. It's going to be ending up being one of the longer ones. You know, when we talk about the section that we've been tested on, quizzed on, please do listen and read the instructions for the quizzes and for the midterm before you start. All right, before you begin your attempts, read the instructions carefully and understand how you're supposed to be answering the questions. Please and thank you. The elders believe that a better understanding of the relationship that First Nations have with the Creator would result in greater respect from non-Aboriginal people. And they believe that this understanding could be a starting point for the healing that many communities need to undergo. This has been such an important aspect of trying to, when we start to begin to wrap up the course, near the end of the course, and look at reconciliation, mending the relationship. Well, did we ever have a relationship? That's what reconciliation kind of assumes. Here on the plains, when you look at our history and what we went through, the genocide that occurred here, it's very difficult. I don't think anybody could argue that there was no relationship here. There was a complete disregard to the ways of knowing and being that existed here, and it resulted in a considerable amount of personal tragedy and societal tragedy and people's tragedies. The white man's colonial mission statement, I'll just end this lecture with this. Now it is evident from the history of the reserves that the Indians there are regarded no longer as in a wild and primitive state, but as in a condition of transition from barbarism to civilization. The object of the system is to segregate the red from the white population in order for the former may be trained up to a level with the latter. We're going to end this term looking at St. Catherine's milling case in chapter 16 as part of the last module, and this is taken from that case. All right, the actual reading of the verdict at the end. It's an interesting take on the two realities and understandings of reality from both perspectives. So with that, I will say I will see you soon, and I am going to get that Zoom meeting set up pretty quick. Okay? Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.